we can look up the bios of our people on the panel. Phil Morle is partner at Main Sequence Ventures. He's been a fixture in the startup community over some time. He's previously a co-founder of Spreets and Pollinizer, which I'm sure many of you will know. Silvia Pfeiffer, CEO of Coviu, which is a D61 spin-out. She'll be known to many of the people in this room. She's obviously been a NICTA and D61 researcher and is considered a world expert in video compression. Dr. Kate Brooks is the WA Director at MPTConnect, the Growth Centre for Medical Pharmaceutical Technologies, is that right? She's an astrophysicist, has previously worked as a long-time researcher at the CSIRO and worked on the Square Kilometre Array program. Professor Michael Biercuk, God, I only just asked you about that, my apologies, is the CEO of Q Control and is a professor of quantum computing?
Quantum physics and quantum technology.
Quantum physics and quantum technology at the University of Sydney, and has been obviously very high profile in what is an increasingly high profile area of research in quantum, certainly something that Australia is quite getting quite excited about right now. I've also been asked by the panelists to find out where the audience is from, so we can get a bit of an idea of what, how to direct this conversation. So, I mean, between university researchers, the business and the private sector, or government and policymakers, can we do a show of hands for people who are from research community or universities? And from business community, private sector, and government policy makers. Oh, that's a great mix.
There you go.
Yeah, that's fantastic. In fact, I'm guessing, I wouldn't want to speak for the organisers, but I think that is exactly the crowd that they wanted to get in the room. Okay, so by way of introduction, is research commercialisation broken? This is not a new question to anyone who has lived in Australia for any period of time. I think it's fair to say, and numerous reports, literally dozens of reports, have told us that we do terrific research. We haven't extracted the maximum we haven't captured that economic value from that research in the way that perhaps our OECD peers have. A year ago at this event, Adrian Turner, the the just resigned CEO of D61, released a report done by Alpha Beta that contained one of the great statistics, or the great numbers of the many reports that have come out. It found that if Australia can just be average, if we can just meet the OECD average on 4 key metrics of output, there's $315 billion in it for us. So it's kind of a measure of the value that we're leaving on the table with some of our research. Not to bore you, I'll finish with this, but the Innovation Science Australia, the Commonwealth body that also produced a report on sort of a 2030 foresighting report. Bill Ferris said in his introduction, just at a time when Australia needs to accelerate its innovation performance, we are falling behind our global peers. He pointed out STEM education, but also business investment in R&D as 2 areas that we perform exceedingly badly in. He says this is more than a canary chirp in our economic mineshaft. It is a clarion call for national action. So I'm going to ask Michael to start simply by asking, is research commercialisation broken? And can you see any evidence that our business, academic and political leaders are heeding this clarion call for national action?
I think the short answer is yes, it's totally broken. But the aim for blame is not where all the policy levers are currently pointing, or the current policy guns, I guess. Everybody is pointing at the researchers as the point of failure, and I think that's fundamentally flawed. I don't think the issue has anything to do with the quality of the researchers or even their desire to potentially do things that are commercially focused. I think the problem, and I should say very clearly, I span both academia and the private sector. I run a company, right? It's private sector. The issue is largely on the industry side and the interface of industry with other parts of the economy. So the first thing to say is that there's no surprise in this, although I'm sure I'm going to make some of you angry, the third of you who put up your hands from industry, that incumbent industry in Australia is largely rent-seeking. It's largely property, it's largely big banks, and it's horribly risk-averse, right? And in fact, it's not just industry, it's industry responding to incentives, because just like Sydney 10 years ago only had giant pubs with sticky carpets, because that's what the regulatory framework was like, there were no small bars, all the regulatory frameworks incentivize very big companies that have a business model that is risk-averse, right? Startups are a real way to change that. And deep tech startups in particular, that I think we'll talk about a lot, are a great way to bridge this gap. But when it comes to the interface of, say, the startup community with university sector, there are kind of policy issues that come from both government and the universities themselves that make this really difficult. And the biggest one is the name technology translation, or even research translation. Because what it fundamentally leaves out is the role of the founder, of the inventor, right? Many of the incentives and the policy structures in place that come from government, et cetera, push universities to build an IP portfolio that they can then sell as an object in itself, without integrating the experts who actually are motivated to build that information into a commercial success story. So I think, to wrap it up, fundamentally we have policy issues that come from the fact that universities keep getting their budgets cut, so they have to seek capital somewhere, and they see extracting money from selling their IP portfolio as a way to do this, which screws up everything in terms of sponsoring startups. It comes from the lack of R&D investment from larger established industries, and it comes from, of course, the government policies that set all those things in place. I do think it is totally broken, but I also think that it's not actually that hard to fix, right? And we can talk about that more in the next few minutes.
Okay, I'm going to ask Phil Morle, because he is, as the director of Main Sequence Ventures, obviously a venture capital arm, I suppose, for want of a better term, of the CSIRO. I'm not going to say he came to the rescue, but got involved with Michael,
Yep.
understood his business, and have put some money in.
Yep.
So, I mean, that looks like a good outcome. That surely points to a system that's working.
Yeah, I mean, my view is that research commercialization is broken, but it's getting much, much better. And it's changing at a rapid rate. And those of you that are in universities will sort of see, I hope, lots of changes happening, obviously different in different universities. But in the case of Mike's company, Q Control is a sort of classic example of what we do at Main Sequence, which was we invest in science-driven companies across the whole system of Australia that have some connection with publicly funded research. So Mike was running a lab in the University of Sydney, and we found a valuable opportunity for venture capital getting involved in what is a rapidly emerging quantum computing industry, and found the sweet spot where actually the commercialization opportunity was ready for us to get going. And I think Sydney University did a brilliant job with this in the end, because we were, I think, from decision to being out 3 months?
About that, yeah.
Something like that. Which those of you that have tried, Silvia will tell you a horror story. It can take years, but things are changing very quickly. And in our fund, we have to get good at it, and we have to learn about the mechanics of what's working and what isn't working. And to give you another example, I think this is an interesting example because it's going to point to exactly the same group of people in the CSIRO. And one of our earliest deals with food and agriculture in CSIRO took 2 years to get out of CSIRO. The whole discussion took a phenomenally long amount of time. You may have heard the phrase time kills deals. It absolutely does. It just becomes a little bit less valuable, a little bit less urgent. People become a little bit more cross and not really wanting to do what was exciting them 2 years ago. But that same team recently, we've just done a deal with CSIRO. And I should say most of our deals are not with CSIRO. These are just 2 examples. We did a deal. We basically decided to found a company out of food and agriculture around October last year. We founded the company in January, funded the company in January. Company operationalized and is now quite a large next generation food company called V2 Food, which was only possible because of research and the private sector working together. So in this case, it's the Hungry Jack's Empire and CSIRO's food science coming together. Neither one of those organizations could have done it. No one could have done that. And equally, no individual founder could have done it without the benefits of those 2 organizations. But that has literally created millions of dollars worth of value for everyone involved in 8 months. And the difference between the 2 is actually what Mike said, which is people centricity. Focus on the opportunity, not chipping away at all the clauses in a contract. Focus on what's possible in 10 years, not what we have in front of us today as this kind of little slice of IP. And what I find is the more people do that, the more interesting the deals are, the more quickly people get the deals done, the more everybody's focused on making that deal a terrific outcome. And I'm seeing more and more of that across the research community.
And I should have said at the beginning, obviously there'll be a Q&A at the end of this, so you'll get a chance to ask panelists directly, and I'm sure the panelists will also stick around afterwards. Silvia Pfeiffer, so the Coviu is a spin out from NICTA / Data61.
Yep.
So, I mean, we have heard that you've got a horror story, so, I mean, we don't have to focus on the horror, but maybe we can get some insight from that experience and maybe, a way forward.
I'm thinking about a way to explain the progress we've made despite my horror story. So I'll start 13 years ago. 13 years ago, I created a first company called Sequence back in the day. Maybe some people here still remember that. And that was in video technology, actually video search, back before we had Google doing video search. And I tried to create that out of CSIRO as well. It was impossible. I basically just went away and started from scratch, built everything from scratch, and tried to build it that way. And then commercialization was impossible because at that time we had no money in the VC industry. Seriously, there was, I think, one fund that had $10 million, and that was all there was. If we compare that to today, we got probably close to $1 billion in the VC space right now in Australia.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking the other day when I founded Pollenizer 10 years ago, the entire venture capital pool was smaller than our fund.
Exactly.
Today.
Exactly, smaller than your fund today.
Yeah.
And so while I'm just going to tell you my horror story in a minute, but the environment has changed fundamentally. The environment for creating startups has changed fundamentally. I'm talking to all of you entrepreneurs that have a research background to encourage you to actually try it and not just listen to my horror story. Because the environment has really changed and has improved heaps. I wouldn't be sitting here without the investment that we got from Sequence Ventures last year. And I wouldn't be having a business that's close to revenue positive without having done that step. Because last year, when we were in CSIRO, it was minuscule. Like we had built something, but it was minuscule revenue. So there was a big trust being put into us by Sequence. And I think it was all around the team as much as the idea. And knowing that the kind of grit we put through just getting out of CSIRO, and I'm getting to the horror story. When I joined CSIRO, or NICTA back in 2012, we were working on a new technology called WebRTC, which is now just part of the browser APIs and nothing as exciting anymore. In America, there was one company after the other created that got lots and lots of investment into this space, and I was trying to build something like that in Australia. It took me from 2012 to 2018 to build enough of a profile and to build enough interest in the Australian market to get this investment. So part of that was a transition between, NICTAB was actually merged into CSIRO. That slowed us down probably about a year. And part of that was also the negotiations around how to do the spin out. My goal was to actually create an Australian company, not just to license the technology to somebody, because there's different pathways of commercializing IP. Licensing is one that is more traditionally used because it bears less risk. The person who licenses the technology takes the risk, not the research institute, not the inventor. It is easier on the R&D organization, but it is really the easy way out. When I'm asked to choose between two ways, the easy way and the hard way, I'll usually take the hard way. Which is what I've done in this space. So it took me about 4 years just to get everything in place, to have a team, the commercialization route, the negotiations in place with CSIRO, the decisions on shareholding, etc., and a investor lined up. It's not easy, but if there's a person that wants to do it in the team, getting back to what Michael said, it really takes an individual to pull it through, or a team. We should build on these teams. As more often than not, we do not look at the individuals. We have tall poppy syndrome in Australia. We don't really pay enough attention to the power that stands behind an individual and an individual team.
I'll bring Kate Brooks, Dr. Kate Brooks, into this now. I wanted to ask you a couple of things. Firstly, on the growth networks policy, government has identified a series of specific industries where they've funded these growth network organisations. Kate's involved in the medical tech and pharmaceuticals one. So how do you, in that organisation, engage with research and deep tech? So that's question one. Question two is something that Mike said earlier around effectively saying that business has been a bit asleep at the wheel in terms of looking at what Australian research has to offer. So I wonder if you're going to kind of address both of those. I know you've come out of the kind of corporate sector as well, so over to you.
Yeah, I can talk to that. I mean, I was at Wesfarmers for the past 2 years, up until 6 weeks ago. So the role in Wesfarmers was one of their innovation managers for their businesses in the chemicals, energy and fertilisers conglomerate. So certainly can share that corporate view. It's week 6 now in the medtech space, so learning that. So the MPTConnect, as you say, is one of the growth centres, and one of our metrics really, and what the government supports us to do is to work with researchers and more broadly the innovation ecosystem to create economic growth and jobs. So that includes commercialising and creating startups and helping them scale. One thing we do is connect these new ventures to global markets. I'm just returning from Boston, where we took a delegation of 30 SMEs to Boston for the Global MedTech Annual Conference, and we set them up with investors, with other I guess contacts to help them take their product to market. With medtech and pharma, it's a global market, so you have to be global from day one. So we also work with running workshops and other educational activities as well. And the MPTConnect also work closely with government to help identify policies and other legislation, things that might need to change. So I think, just coming back to the question, is research commercialisation broken? I don't think it's broken. I think it's just really hard. And all commercialisation is really hard. Research as well. And I think there's a whole different skill set required from research to take a product to market. And we've had a lot of dialogue of late about why researchers need to translate their stuff out of the lab and get it into the market. And I think we're now grappling with, we get the why, the researchers get the why, but now they're grappling with the how. And this is the bit that's hard, right? And research is very much focused on being judged on scientific merit. And when you move into the commercialization space, you're being judged on market and profitability merit. Very different. And it's not obvious to me that the skills of a researcher are what it takes to get, match the skills of a commercialization venture.
On that, a couple of you have mentioned the need to focus on the founder, or the need to focus on the individual who might drive some of these outcomes. I mean, it seems in Australia in recent years we kind of solved the dearth of venture capital through various incentive measures. We're not awash with money, but there is money around. So what kind of policy positions do you think might be taken that would improve that focus on founders, or is it simply the institutions have to, focus themselves?
But I think that's the thing. It is happening. It was never going to happen overnight. It was never going to happen like someone sends out an edict to all the universities and magic happened and it all changed. If I look back, someone that's been doing this for many, many years, even 5 years ago, walking into a room of researchers saying, tell me what you do. And just hearing blah, 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 blah. I don't really understand what you're saying. They were speaking in their own language. They were speaking in the language of the research. And to Kate's point, it was very much about the nature of the research and the technology and the invention, not the market, its purpose, who's going to consume it, what are the other opportunities for it. That is dramatically changed now. And I'm not just talking about small pockets of researchers that you'll find in the corners of special universities. Actually, it's happening en masse. And I think there's been a very decisive approach towards doing that, which is actually having results. What's emerging out of that, again, we have this sort of dialogue of, are researchers entrepreneurial? Well, some are and some aren't. And actually, just as, some firemen are entrepreneurial and some aren't. There's different people have different skills. So the art is finding the combination of people and sharing with the broader group the value and benefit of market, of customer, so that when the research is happening at the right time, it starts to get directed towards something which is more likely to be commercializable. And again, not in a transitional stage gate sort of way, but a sort of general approach. So I think it's getting much better, and we're starting to see that.
Sorry, I have to interject at this point. This is where I feel like I differ a little bit in view from both Phil and Kate. I think it is unreasonable to assume that researchers should bear responsibility for commercialization in all cases, right? And this is where the narrative usually focuses. Researchers need to be better at understanding markets, right?
I don't think that's what we're saying. I'm not saying that.
Well, you did talk about how researchers need to understand product and things like that. And I say there are some of us who do. And those of us who do and are interested should be encouraged. And the most important thing is getting the policy levers right to allow us to succeed, instead of demanding change in the research community, which has been the dominant narrative. Researchers need to focus more on impact. Researchers need to focus more on commercialization. Researchers think too much about what they like. Well, researchers give up huge amounts of money in exchange for the freedom to pursue deep scientific or technical questions that can advance humanity overall. And if we say, well, that's not really valuable, what's valuable is the commercialization aspect, that messes up everything. So I want to focus on the areas where we can change policy to allow those researchers who are interested, who feel the internal drive, not the extrinsic, gun to the head. If you don't move in the commercialization sector, you're not going to have any research funding, right? That's not the right approach. We've done all stick and no carrot, right? And the carrot needs to be about incentives. And everything right now disincentivizes researchers from pursuing this, because there are limits on how much equity you can have as a researcher spinning something out. There are tremendous bureaucratic hurdles. We heard all about this from Silvia and from Phil about what it's like to get something out of a public sector research organization. Everything is currently policy-wise stacked against the people who want to do this. So instead of focusing on the people who don't want to, which is quite fair, why don't we focus on helping the people who want to? That's my general
And
argument.
that's super important.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I was just going to mention my point that I wanted to make is that commercialization requires different skill sets. I'm not suggesting researchers need to learn those skill sets. It can be a different team that takes it through the commercialization process, but it requires different skill sets. And I think the team is very important, coming back to everyone's point. If you're investing or you are a corporate wanting to engage in a new venture, an A team with a B product is better than a B team with an A product. So the team is everything.
Okay, I'm going to we're going to go to questions in about 30 seconds, but I just very quickly wanted to try and open up Silvia and Mike. So you're two researchers who are now founder CEOs. So I have no doubt that you had plenty of opportunity to do other things like join a corporate, join an IBM, or join a Microsoft for you, Mike.
I did work at Google at one stage.
So why do a startup, and why do it in Australia? Why do that startup in Australia? That you were talking about how much easier it would have been in the US, and Mike, obviously a lot of the work being done in your area is the US. So why?
I want to make a difference in Australia. We've CSIRO, so I came to Australia in 1999 to work for CSIRO, and CSIRO, looking at it from Germany, had this awesome opportunity because it was doing research and commercialization. And you know, commercialization for me was this magic thing of taking something out of the lab and getting it into people's hands. So actually, my understanding of commercialization was more around productization and getting it into people's hands. But the reality when I came here was actually very different. The reality was it was all around research, which was measured based on number of publications, and commercialization was measured based on how much money you could get into the organization. So how is that delivering value to Australia if it's all about just getting money into CSIRO? That's not thinking about the big picture of making change for Australia. And worse so, it actually puts a mindset into everybody's mind, into everybody's head around how can we get more money for what we're doing rather than how can we get this technology that we're doing out of the lab. And part of the consequence of that is that when I started, the request was, if you're going to do a spin out, first you have to either pay for the IP that you're taking out, or you give us 50% of your company. Who's going to do that? That's never going to happen.
That's to Mike's point. Sounds like you've been swimming against the tide somewhat. And Mike, very briefly, and then we'll go to questions.
Sure. I guess my answer is a little bit less altruistic. It was a combination of wanting to have impact and recognizing that for good or for ill, no matter how senior I became as a professor, there were certain doors that were closed to me, and magically they have all opened up as soon as I put CEO after my name instead of PhD. I think it's kind of sad, but it's reality. And then the other part is I wanted to, have what I found to be an enjoyable existence. And I worked at a big 3 management consulting firm before, one of the largest, and it was probably the most miserable 3 years of my life. I have never been more unhappy than dealing with bureaucratic meetings about geographic expansion strategies for a giant organization. The idea of building something new and trying to deliver value to a much broader sector of the market, steer narrative, shape the field, because quantum is such a new field and Q-Control is a very early player in it, that was what was exciting to me.
Okay, we're going to go to the floor for questions. I guess if you raise your hand, there is a microphone that will go around. We have
There's a question.
Someone here.
Yeah, there's a question right there.
Hi, thanks everyone. So Michael, my question is sort of following on from what you were drawing out in terms of getting the policy levers right to incentivize researchers with the skills, capacity and the drive to take their work out of the lab. What do you think some of those policy levers would be? Is there a case study internationally that you think we could gear towards? And just to add another question, if we've got time, how do you see big industry in Australia playing a role in that lever?
Great, it's a great question. I would say the first thing is everything right now is set up to incentivize universities to collect IP and then sell that IP via licensing or whatever arrangements to some large third party. But as any researcher in the room knows, the least effective way to actually accomplish some outcome is to give somebody a PDF of your paper, right? The most effective way is to work directly with them. And that's the founder-driven part of it that is completely absent. There are no incentives right now for founders to proceed in building a company. The university will either take some equity or you'll enter an IP negotiation that will take 30 years. What I think works well by case study is something called creator-owned content. It's not something I invented. This is widely used in other places. The best example is the University of Waterloo in Canada, which is, it's near Toronto. It has this enormous ecosystem of small startups that are coming out. There's the Creative Destruction Lab there, which is funded by a lot of Silicon Valley VCs, right? Toronto is not in Silicon Valley, but the Silicon Valley VCs all get deeply involved. The whole idea is that if you, as a public sector researcher, you're a university professor, develop something new, right? First of all, you publish, right? You share your scientific knowledge. But then any commercial activity that goes from there and royalties and et cetera, you own it. The university does not own it because the role of the university is not to generate revenue on the backs of commercial sales. It's to educate and generate and disseminate knowledge. And fortunately, the university is sufficiently well funded that they can take this general view. And it has led to a real blooming of the startup ecosystem around the University of Waterloo because people have no problem starting companies with IP that they generated while they were academics, right? Here it's very, very difficult. There is a university that shall remain nameless. It is not mine. University of Sydney is not this university. But it has a rule on the books that a founder who wants to do a spin-off based on research that they may have had a grant for can hold no more than either 2 or 5% equity in the company. Well, who's going to go through all the hell of starting a company and finding venture capital and the sleepless nights and all this for 2% equity? No one. And any VC will tell you that if a founder is diluted too much, it becomes uninvestable because there's very limited motivation, right? So I think some of these policy perspectives that can drive people towards having an actual incentive to taking on these life-changing, high-risk, very difficult enterprises is very valuable. I think the role for large industry, to your second question, is either through kind of corporate VC in some cases, or being customers, right? I think being customers of high quality products is a better way to go. I know there's, in fintech, there's a big move that the banks kind of build these fintech companies together. I think it would be better if the fintech companies were independent in selling high quality products to the banks. Sorry, fintech people.
Anyone else want to have a crack at that question?
I've got a couple of things. One is, as an investor, one of the most powerful heuristics about something being investable is a person saying, I want to do this. And so any sort of research system which kind of disincentivizes that, to your point, Mike, it kind of basically removes sort of a powerful force towards an opportunity happening. One of the best organizations I've seen at fixing this is actually in London. The Imperial College has a program called Founder's Choice. And I remember speaking to them and saying, but how does it work? Like when you want to actually get something out, who makes the decision? And they said, well, the founder does. It's the founder's choice. That's why we've called it Founder's Choice. So basically, but what often happens in Australia is a researcher will say, I think there's a commercial opportunity here. And then it's kind of, they're pushed aside whilst the organization goes and figures out what the most appropriate commercialization strategy is. And that's the separation that Mike and all of us have been talking about, which is which is kind of dangerous. I agree with you on what you're saying about the businesses being customers, like look for more startups to work with. But I also do feel that there is a very big missed opportunity for companies to look inside research to discover deep opportunities for their product set and to actually make those products come to life. So again, this business that we've just launched that I was talking about, V2 Food, could not have happened. So Hungry Jack's could not have done that without, on their own. They don't know the molecular science of proteins. So they can't make a plant-based meat patty. But because the research team and the company had access to them, that company is international, making millions of dollars within months, right? And that's just not possible to do without the interaction with a big company.
Yeah.
So I think there's lots of opportunities, and I hope more big companies will start looking for them.
Can I just give that big company perspective, because I think we are seeing a shift in the way corporates especially are engaging with researchers and startups. But I think we have to be very clear here that a corporate its principal driver is to return profit to its shareholders. It actually doesn't care about research. It doesn't care about your research or your research. It cares about making money. And there are aspects of social citizenship and investing in an ecosystem and boosting economic growth that will come from a fraction of that corporate to do good for the ecosystem. But its primary incentive is to make money. Now, the reason it's starting to engage more with research and startups is because with this whole new global market, and we heard yesterday about Industry 4.0, everything is fast. So corporates traditionally would have done stuff themselves. They would have figured it out in-house. And we've got some, in WA, we've got some of amazing innovation and research in sort of robotics and remote operations, all done in-house. Now there is no time to do that in-house and learn those new skills. So corporates are incentivized to partner with startups, with researchers, to get knowledge fast, to beat the competitors globally. So that's the opportunity for startups and researchers to engage with corporates. And it comes back to, this point earlier about find out what the corporate's challenge is, find out what they're trying to solve fast, and that's the opportunity to engage. The corporate is not looking to fund your research unless it's going to drive their bottom dollar.
You could call that short-termism, right? Because 26% of all economic output in Australia comes from scientific discoveries in the last 30 years. And so if corporates that are not very, very new and kind of in a fragile place took a strategic perspective about their life cycle instead of just, ASX returns, then we'd have a different narrative.
Well, Wesfarmers is the oldest company in Australia, sort of 100-year. That attitude has served them very well, and they're very keen. They were very keen to engage with researchers and startups, but it has to be solving their challenges and solving their. They've got to return value to their stakeholders. So I think that's the mindset that has to shift, and that's part of this food. It's starting with the challenge. Start with a challenge. That's the opportunity for the startup. You've got to market there immediately. You can go to market if you know there's a challenge there that needs an answer.
Right, we're going to go to another question. If we've got one out there, gentleman down the front here.
Thank you all, Fred Chilton, and I certainly endorse what Phil has said about the change in the ecosystem that I've certainly seen in my lifetime. My question is, yesterday we heard from Cisco that one of the problems faced by major international corporates dealing with research is that the researchers had an overinflated view of how much of the value of the end product came from their research. And they said the professors thought it was 90% and that 10% was the rest, whereas they said it's $1 to do the research, $10 to get a product that's viable, and $100 to get into a market-leading position. And so it'd be interesting to get the panel's views on that, and how do we get that realistic balance, being fair to the researchers, the professors, that they get a decent chunk that's enough to incent them, and yet the deal still happens and doesn't get held up because of unrealistic expectations.
I actually want to take this one step further. You said 1%, the researchers are the ones that don't understand the value of their product. I actually think it's the research institutions that think they own the IP, and they think that because the research institutions had this idea that's 90% of the market value, therefore they deserve to own 90% of the company, when in fact 90% of it is in execution. If you don't execute in the market right, the best technology is worth nothing. And we know these stories. We know it. Betacam Max was, better technology than VCR. And I know this is an old story. Probably shows my age. But the best products aren't usually the ones that make it. It's all about execution, and that's what the research institutions have to start understanding. And they are. I've seen a huge move at least at universities, where universities are now saying, okay, we can leave the IP with a PhD student and just see what's happening. Watch from the outside. I haven't seen it as much at CSIRO. I think there's still overinflated expectations when a researcher or a research group out of the CSIRO tries to spin out as to what the value of that organization and the CSIRO contribution should be. I think we need to let go of IP a lot more, and then let it flower and become something in the market before we ask for all this return. We imagine that it's worth this much and we want to own this much out of it, but in fact, by letting go, we're probably going to get bigger rewards from it than by holding on to it.
I think we need to teach people what NPV is, right?
Yes.
That's kind of the answer to your question. You take today's value and you discount based on likelihood of transition to some commercial opportunity. I personally like to shy away from the narrative of one side gets it and the other side doesn't, because both sides are probably wrong to some degree. There's no question that the internet would not exist if we didn't have basic research in quantum physics from the 1920s that led to the transistor, et cetera. All the same, running a company, it's quite obvious that a lot of the cost incurred is associated with developing a product and product market fit and distribution and all these things. I think if we just have a more engaged discussion about some of these financial terms, like net present value, we can overcome some of these things instead of turning it into a one side versus the other.
I think Cisco's spot on. I think what Kevin said yesterday is absolutely spot on, and the taking a product to market is really hard, and it requires a lot of effort. And I think from corporates and investors looking at a product, we heard in Boston last week exactly to that point. The product's a given. Just assume the product works. What the investors and corporates are interested in is the team that's first. Who's on the team that's got the skills to take this to market, and who's had the experience before doing this, and what's the market? Where are you selling it? What's the profitability? The product itself is a given, and you just assume it works. And the two discussion points are on the team and the market value.
Which does, of course, lead to Theranos, right? So,
sorry, that's really loud.
There's an excellent book, Mariana Mazzucato, which has a very spirited defense of public sector research and its contribution to the end value of products. There's an entire I can't remember the name of the book, if anyone can. I'll come back to you. Anyway, she has an entire chapter that takes apart an iPhone effectively and traces back where each of the pieces of technology come from. And it's all government-funded public tech. I guess the learning from that story, I suppose, is that those companies, including the VC companies, but large corporates and small companies that were acquired by those large companies in the making of those technologies and products, had a very, in the US, had a very sharp eye on the research that was taking place and got amongst it early and extracted value from it.
I think I want to just emphasize how important this role of public sector research is, even in supporting like VC-backed startups. I mean, my favorite example is Palantir. Anybody heard of Palantir? Giant data analytics company worth billions and billions of dollars. Peter Thiel was involved in founding it. The only reason it exists in any form at the scale it does is because their first contract was $1.5 billion with the CIA,
Yeah,
right? That is effectively public sector research investment,
yeah.
right? And I think we should not discount how important the government can be as both an early supporter in research and then a supporter as a commercial customer.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point, and it's something, you know, when we talk about, I think you were being a little bit critical of corporate Australia in not really taking risks or being short-termist.
It's not just Australia, to be fair.
Sure, but in Australia we seem to have a cultural cringe around locally developed tech, local research. This is particularly the case I see in the stuff I do in government procurement. There's all sorts of industry development programs around trying to help entrepreneurs and small businesses and innovative companies, but they'd probably be better off just buying from them, providing them with some kind of contract to get them going. This would be the same in corporate.
I disagree with that actually with startups. So I think, and I've just been part of a LinkedIn article on this recently. You can check it out. I wrote together with one of my Cisco colleagues. With both Cisco and Wesfarmers, our experiences we drew from, and we saw that when a startup gets to pitch with a corporate, as an innovation manager, I could get everyone in the room and they're all engaged, ready to work with this startup that has no track record. We're really investing in a couple of the team members on tech we know nothing about, and we're actually not even sure what the value is. So already the corporate's up against, like, we've already got cold feet. And there's a conversation, and then the startup sends us a bill to get going. And it immediately makes it a client-vendor relationship. It's not a partnership anymore. It's not a collaboration. It's not co-innovation. We're immediately judging them on vendor criteria, value for money, risk, all of that procurement stuff kicks in, and it doesn't get up. So, you know, I would love to see a lot more where the startup works with the corporate in partnership, like what you've mentioned, both take the product to market. So the startup uses the corporate.
I mean, there is an issue with a smaller company that certainly the smaller companies engaging with government. I mean, maybe there are companies that engage too early, but engaging, like trying to sell to government, you can sell yourself out of business fairly quickly. Just trying to talk to government about how you should work with them as opposed to the other way around. The investment, like people who've got to put food on their table, will go out of business if they can't send a bill.
Yeah, so we saw a lot more success with startups that came in and said, you know what, give us access to your site. We'll set it up. We'll show you how it works. Yes, they would have taken a hit to, loss lead to get that. But once they're in the door and there was a relationship built and they're demonstrating their product, they were in. They were scaling and, they were looked after. It's just breaking that initial, shifting away from a vendor to actually let's work together and scale this.
I might disagree with the categorization of that. I mean, that to me sounds like sales process, right? The best way to get a sale is you start doing initial demos and you take the hit of how much it's going to cost you, et cetera. I don't see a future in which any VC-backed startup goes to its first client and has a collaboration of co-invention, because then they don't own anything, right? Then the corporate owns it.
I haven't talked about those partnerships may not necessarily involve equity, or there's a whole bunch of stuff you could do to sort of set that. In some cases, we got a free license. So if the startup went well, we could use their stuff beyond our involvement. There's a whole bunch of stuff to do, and it is about sales. I mean, what else is it about? It's about sales.
Yeah, but then it's still a customer-client-vendor relationship. It's just they're doing good pre-sales.
Yeah, but if ultimately the startup gets sales from this, track record, backing, sales, like that's a sales funnel.
I would argue that the risk is being taken by the startup as opposed to the corporate. If it works out for the corporate, they're all good, but for the startup, if it doesn't work out, well, they've just been working for free.
So
and there would be a fair bit of failure I would think, in those.
Can I just jump in here with something that can untie that knot? And we've seen that work in the past. So New South Wales government, until recently, had this thing called partnership grants. And that's a way for a startup to work with a large organization and get some funding that would sort of cover the expenses of the startup while working with the corporate on something new that the corporate wasn't quite sure yet whether it was going to be commercially valid.
Exactly.
But so the idea is to give the startup an ability to work on this technology without having to worry about, putting food on the table, while also giving the corporate an ability to not having to worry about a vendor relationship. And I thought that was a brilliant idea.
So
it worked really well for us. We're working with a huge American company, Pearson Clinical, on a product there where we can bring into Coviu. It works really well for us. Unfortunately, I think they've closed this down.
Yeah.
So I'm really unhappy about this. Just anyone out of the New South Wales government here, this is a message to you.
I think that's a good point. I think that's where policy can make a difference. And we're not talking much. It's like not a lot to get in the door and do a proof of concept. So 10, 20, 30,000, that's sometimes all these invoices were. It's like, that's really not about the money. It's not about the money.
For this partnership grant that we got a lot of in-kind contribution from the corporate, and I think that's much easier to get than them paying money.
Yes,
at least for the first entry.
All right, another question. Anyone? I think there's someone up the back.
Anybody?
There we go.
Need to project,
Try.
James.
It's working now.
Yeah.
Just yell.
Just shout, mate.
I'll shout.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for a superb panel discussion. I hope the recording is going to go out so that the rest of the community can engage on this topic too.
The signal's there.
Given that we can see some best practices in other countries where universities make it easy, or institutions make it easy to take research out into the public, should we be giving as much funding to institutions that make it difficult? Should public money and donors lean on the scales to make this accepted practice in Australia?
We should give more, right? Because the whole issue is incentives. The universities are incentivized to take IP and go like this because they're desperate for capital, right? Because the government keeps cutting funding. So I think you want to do the opposite. You want to support the research such that the university doesn't feel the need to look at research as a cost center, right? And then find revenue streams that they can derive from it. I think you want to separate those things in order to facilitate the translation.
So give more money to those who are good?
No, give more money to support basic research such that the whole question of commercialization is separate, right? Right now it's finding revenue that is driving university behavior around commercial translation, as opposed to viewing their role as like social impact, or which is what I think they should do, or just supporting the people within the institution that want to do this. I think we incentivize the wrong way.
Another question over here. We've got about 3 minutes left, so.
In that situation, should there be any regulation around keeping the investment in Australia?
Which investment?
Or keeping the company in Australia? So
No.
Any strings attached?
No. I mean, Australia is so tiny.
That's an interesting point, because I know in WA especially, the government wants to grow jobs for the state. That's ultimately why they're investing in these startup initiatives. So they're kind of conflicted when the startup becomes successful and follows the market and possibly leaves the state to go global. So there's this, conflict of celebrating them leaving and being global, but actually they've left the state. So I think this is about the metrics of success and why you invest in this ecosystem need to reflect that it can't just be jobs and growth for Australia, for the state. It has to be somehow, celebrating the success of those startups when they leave.
Yeah, and hope they come back with bags of capital, I suppose. We've got one here.
Just on the role of government funding, we talked about VCs and startups, and then you've got government with accelerating commercialisation grants. How effective are they? Is it government picking winners? And then we've got the controversy
I think Silvia's point was probably the best on it, if you want to echo it.
The one about the grants?
Yeah, the
Government
grants to support these, like the initial NRE kind of stuff.
Yes.
Right?
So I'm not sure I agree with you pour more money into fundamental research, but I think we need to think about diversifying where we place our money. So there is money that needs to go into fundamental research. There's money that needs to go into applied research, but there also is money that needs to go into supporting startups and who actually help translate that research into products. Because productization is a whole challenge by itself. I don't think we've actually really understood the amount of effort and work that goes into productization. We talk about R&D, that's research and development. That usually takes us to an MVP, which is a great demonstrator. Everybody gets excited about it and thinks the problem is solved. Well, that's the 1% of the problem. The 99% still needs to get done, and we do not appreciate the amount of effort and money that goes into doing those 99%. That's the productization and putting it into people's hands, and there needs to be money going towards that. So CSCP grants go towards that, the commercialization partnership grant goes towards that. There's a couple of grants in that space. It's just completely out of whack from a balance point of view, the amount of money we put into that.
I would also say there's a gap right now in the kind of the middle. So there are these grants that support early stage startups. There's lots of money for really, really little startups, very, very young, 10K, 20K, 30K. And then there's like this infinite bottomless pit of money if you're a giant industry that wants to get Oz industry money, right? It's just like unlimited funding through Center for Defense and Industry Capability, all these things. But if you're in the middle, if you're at this like successful stage, but still pretty small, maybe you just have a little bit of revenue, but you got VC funding, the current view is you're too successful and you should be ineligible for a lot of these grants, right? That they want to support the really little tiny ones. So
Yes.
it's again the valley of death,
money.
right? Yeah,
Growth
absolutely.
needs money.
Yeah,
100%.
the scale ups. That's
I think we've done a pretty good job in defining the problem. Have we got one more question?
Hi, sorry, been waiting patiently. There's been lots of discussion about diversity on boards, and I wonder your opinions on how corporates could perhaps change or have different sorts of skill sets in both their executive teams and on boards to help this process along. What sort of skill sets would you call out would be required?
on the boards of the startup or
in corporates, in private sector.
corporate board?
And we're talking diversity in the broadest possible sense, right? Like, so all kinds of different skills, different backgrounds. Yeah. I mean, I find this quite interesting because I'm a startup guy. I'm a founder. You know, I've made small companies, and I now found myself on boards, and some big boards, government boards even. And yeah, I find the conversations peculiar, right? Quite often because I think, you know, as we've all heard, quite often boards are put into a situation of managing risk. And so a lot of the conversation is about risk. A lot of the skills on the board are coming from a risk perspective. I think to Mike's earlier point, when you're looking at the commercial side, you're looking at the short term. You know, is this how we should spend our money to get this sort of next outcome? And so I think we massively don't have enough people who have come from different backgrounds. We don't have researchers on boards, right? We don't have entrepreneurs on boards because what do they know about risk? How are they going to help us not get sued, right? But actually, the conversation that happens in the boardroom is super powerful when you've got sand in the oyster. And that's what I want to see, just more sand in the oyster from these different perspectives so that interesting things happen.
Yeah, and I think just extending that whole argument for diversity, it's also, I think, of merit to have, you know, a corporate on your grant or on your, you know, so broaden that diversity two ways. So researchers engaging with the strategic direction of a corporate and having, you know, a corporate person help drive the strategic direction of your research. It works two ways.
Please don't do that. Please. I mean, I'm very sorry. This is you've hit like my sorest sore point. I think the worst possible thing we can do is start taking long-term research and turning it into short-term research by having corporates determine what problems we should work on. I think you need a diversity of timescales. I think you need some people who work on 50-year timescales, some people who do 20-year research, some people who do short-term stuff, and some people who like our product today, 6-month time horizon to delivery.
So
Doesn't
corporates
it
do
depend?
that. They have Horizon 1, 2, 3 principles, and you'll find many corporates have, 5-year, 10-year, 50-year plans. So they are thinking about the future beyond the next
Right,
financial year.
On that note, I think we found the sand in the oyster, so thank you for that. Yeah, I'll draw this to a close. I did remember the name of that book. I actually looked it up on Google as we were going. Professor Mariana Mazzucato, the book is called The Entrepreneurial State. It is superb, probably for each of the 3 cohorts of people in the room. The value of public sector research to the economy and to business and to society. Very, very well put together. Thank you to our panellists, Kate Brooks, Mike Biercuk, Phil Morle and Silvia Pfeiffer. I hope you guys are going to stay around for a few minutes to let people have a chat and delve in a bit further. Thank you all very much for coming. I hope you all go out and shake the tree and make some noise on this.